Hello folks and welcome to the paddock here at the Mexico City GP with me, Buxton and Lawrence Barretto, because of course news breaking today, Lawrence, that the accepted breach agreement,
ABA we could call it for now.
ABA as we call it, has now been announced for both Red Bull Racing and also of course the fine that has been handed to Aston Martin as well for their procedural breach of the cost cap. Red Bull have been fined $7 million and have been docked 10% of their aerodynamic sort of freedoms going forward for the next 12 months. But as we know, we need to unpack this by reversing all the way back, I think, to 2019.
And that's when the Formula 1 bosses and the FIA came to an agreement that financial regulations are required. They wanted to instill what we call a cost cap. That's a limit on how much the teams can spend, and at the moment it's 141.2 million that they can spend a year, and if they go over that amount they breach the budget cap, and that's kind of what we've been talking about for the first time this year as they came into force this year, that Red Bull have breached that agreement. So when we're looking at for the rest of this season, Williams were the first to kind of commit a procedural breach, 25,000, and that's because they just missed a deadline when they had to submit their full accounts by March. So that was the first time that we started to talk about the cost cap and what it actually means for the teams.
Of course, March this year wasn't the first time that they had to put their accounts in. The first time actually occurred in 2021. Some teams had decided to take a, should we say a dry run. But interestingly, Red Bull weren't one of them.
No, so it was an opportunity for all the teams, because we haven't done this before, and it's actually quite a significant undertaking financially for the accountants to kind of piece this all together. Christian Horner was talking about 75 lines of information that they had to input into the system. So the FIA said, look, let's do a dry run, let's see how it works. We won't penalise for you, but we'll tell you where you could maybe improve your methodology, improve the way that you present these figures. Red Bull chose not to do that. They felt that they were on top of it enough. And even then, when Christian Horner was speaking earlier today, and he was saying when they first submitted it, they didn't get any feedback from the FIA, he said, to say that anything was wrong. And
by that he means anything that they'd taken to be outside the cost cap that was actually inside the cost cap. So the way in which they were doing their accounting, they believed was above board.
Exactly. So the FIA have said throughout of this that the Red Bull have not acted in bad faith. No one's actively trying to go around the rules. It's just that they've interpreted it slightly differently.
So when they put their accounts in March this year, Red Bull Racing believed that they were well within the budget cap.
And that's why Christian was saying, look, we're well below. He was openly saying, look, from what we understand, we're well below it. It's just that when the FIA maybe adjusted the numbers for the way that they interpreted how the financials should look, then it became clear that Red Bull had actually gone over the budget cap.
So this was March this year. We didn't hear anything until September this year when accusations started to come out from a number of teams in the paddock that Red Bull would be found to be in breach of that. But it was only really over the last couple of weeks that we learned that they had been, not by how much, and then this week that we learned by how much they were over. And ultimately it was just north of $1.8 million or pounds? Pounds. Now, that 1.8 million, Christian believed that they were over 3 million under. The FIA found that actually there were a number of line items which they believed were excluded from the cost cap that the FIA believed were included in the cost cap. That took them from over 3 under to 1.8 over. Although interestingly, the FIA did say that within that 1.8, the team hadn't counted at all a 1.4 million pound rebate they should have had from the British government in terms of its tax, which actually took the overspend to closer to 400,000.
Yeah, and I think when you look at it in that context, if you were to remove the 1.4 that Red Bull included but didn't need to include, it's 400,000, which I think is 0.37%. And I think that's why Christian, in large part, is pretty furious about the penalty that he's been given, which, as you said at the top, is 10% reduction in wind tunnel and CFD testing time, and that $7 million US dollar fine, which actually doesn't come off the budget cap though.
And that's a really interesting point here. So the amount of money that they've actually got to play with stays the same. They can take that 7 million from anywhere and it won't affect how much they can spend in future years. That 10% of wind tunnel time though, and CFD time, could have a huge knock-on effect for the team. Already down at 70% of the 100% wind tunnel and CFD time. This will take them down to 63%, and that is from today.
Yeah, so Christian was saying almost they're being penalised. They're not, but because that's the regulations. But they're being penalised because they were so successful, and that's kind of how the sliding scale works. The team that finishes last gets the most wind tunnel testing time. The team that finishes first gets the least. Then when you add on this further penalty, and then he was saying when you compare it to the team that finishes second and third, it will be a 15% to the team in second and 20% to the third team. And I think that's why they're so concerned.
Would you say then that maybe it's not for us to argue, there are still those team bosses in this paddock who today have said the penalty is too lenient, it isn't effective enough. Perhaps they're talking about the financial penalty more so than the aero penalty, because for a 0.3% overspends, they're looking at a 10% reduction in wind tunnel time. Red Bull believe that might be a little bit too harsh. There will still be those in this paddock that think it's not harsh enough. Perhaps we should hear from Christian Horner, though, himself, who's been very vocal today, held a press conference, answered a lot of questions as to his belief of where they stand and why they have accepted to take the penalty, even though they believe it to be egregious.
There's lessons for all concerned out of this. But the FIA, clearly in their statement, they were very clear when they said that there's been no accusation or evidence that RBR has sought at any time to act in bad faith, dishonestly or in a fraudulent manner, nor has it willfully concealed any information from the cost cap administration. So we haven't hidden stuff. We've made our interim submissions. We've been through the process. Perhaps we expected more. Perhaps we should have asked more. That's part of this process. It's been a huge learning experience for us. I'm sure others have learned watching from the sidelines. It's important that the cost cap is an important part of Formula One's success in the future, but it needs to be applied in the right way, and to potentially blow that apart as well, would not have been the right thing to do. It goes without saying it's a one-to-one effect. We cannot do as many wind tunnel runs. We cannot run as many simulations. That will have a material effect on our performance. As I say, it's difficult to put a lap time figure, but one could assume, whilst these regulations are still pretty immature and development is still steep, it could be anywhere between 0.25 and 0.5 of a second in lap time. But what we've lost in ATR, we've gained in motivation. And I've never seen a more motivated group of individuals that have done an outstanding job last year and this year in a regulation change that has probably been the biggest in the last 40 years. And we might have lost 10% in ATR, but I think we've gained 25% in motivation from every single staff member in Milton Keynes.
Now, Lawrence, we're talking about percentage over the cost cap, percentage of wind tunnel time, but what is that in real terms?
So I've spoken to a few people, and it looks like it's around 22 runs in the wind tunnel. Now, that might not sound like a lot, but when you're looking for half a tenth of a second, every run is crucial, especially with these new aerodynamic testing restrictions. Every team is limited anyway.
And you say a half a tenth. Christian earlier today said he believes it could be up to half a second in terms of development for them.
And when you have that kind of gap, that will pull them back down, away maybe for if the form book was the same as last year, away from the likes of Ferrari and Mercedes, and maybe slightly further towards the midfield. And obviously that's why it's such a significant drop for these guys, because it could affect them not just next year, but to 24 as well.
Important to reiterate again, as you've said, the FIA found that there was no ill will on Red Bull's part. It was simply their accounting. They put the wrong things in the wrong columns, got themselves confused, believed they were under, when in fact they were over. Whether this is enough of a deterrent for teams to not look at the fact that they've done this by accident and then do it intentionally, I think it would be a larger penalty if they found someone did it intentionally, because I think some of the leniency in this or perceived leniency, has come from the fact that they didn't do it intentionally. Perhaps, I don't know.
Yeah, and I think also with Aston Martin as well, when they were found to procedurally breach the rules, they've been given a $450,000 fine. There was 12 items on there, but again, it was the same thing. They didn't do anything in bad faith. It was just a procedural issue, and I think these teams are just trying to come to terms with these new regulations.
Trying to understand it.
Exactly. There's nothing about anyone trying to break the rules here. It's just that it's the first year of us trying to understand these new rules, and some teams have just got it wrong.
Some fans, I'm sure, will still be unhappy about it. Depending on who you support, you may think it's too lenient, you may think it's too strong. But one thing is for sure, Christian Horner and Red Bull Racing have accepted their punishment. They and the sport, I think, now wants to draw a line underneath this, move forward, and hope that the next time we have the accounts come through, that with the clarifications we now have, that nobody will be found to be in breach in the future.
Sounds good to me.
All right, sounds good to me too. Right, that's it from us down here in the paddock in Mexico. Time to get on with the racing.